Was Peter the Great a champion for Russian progress or a tyrannical madman? Hello and welcome to part 5 of my series on the Romanovs. Today we're going to talk about Pyotr Alexeyevich, or Peter I of Russia. When Peter's father Alexei died, Peter was only 4 years old, and he was thrown into a very tumultuous political climate due to the Streltsy uprising. The atrocities that he would witness committed by the Streltsy would end up affecting his mental state for the rest of his life. But the outcome of the uprising was a declaration that both Peter and his half-brother Ivan would be made Tsar. And as we discussed in the last episode, their sister Sophia would take over as regent while both Peter and Ivan were coming of age. So this gave Peter a lot of freedom during his childhood that most princes in a palace wouldn't have access to. And from his youth, Peter was very inventive and curious. He took an interest in sciences, in arts and craftsmanship, and even in military matters. So much so that he developed what he would call his toy army, where he and a bunch of young men would get together with arms and cannons and recreate military battles. In one particular instant, he was gifted a sextant, which wasn't very commonly used in Russia at the time. But he was very intrigued and wanted to learn how to use it, so he brought in teachers from outside of Russia. This would lead to his fascination with Western Europe. By 1869, Peter decided that it was time to take back power from his sister Sophia. Sophia had sent members of the Streltsy to detain Peter, but Peter had received word beforehand that they were coming after him. He narrowly escaped the Streltsy by racing to a monastery on horseback wearing nothing but his nightshirt. That toy army that he had spent his youth developing came rather in handy when he then needed to rally support and overthrow Sophia. From there, Peter became Peter I, and his half-brother Ivan became Ivan V. And while they were co-rulers, Ivan was very sickly, and so Peter was left with most of the responsibility. Or he would have been, as Peter's mother was very protective and didn't really let him take as much of a hands-on approach at first. But when his mother passed away in 1694, and when Ivan passed away in 1696, Peter became the sole ruler of Russia. Peter's reign is mainly marked by reforms and expansion. Peter idolized a lot of different aspects about Western Europe, so much so that he embarked on an 18-month trip called the Grand Embassy. There were a few different purposes for this particular trip. First was to gather allies against the Ottoman Empire. The second was to learn from Western Europe. He was inspired by the military, scientific, and technological advances of Europe at the time. He also was intrigued by their art and their culture. And the third and most important reason, he's there to go have a good time. In fact, during his embassy, he caused so much damage to the house that he was visiting in England that when he gave the mistress of the house a tip of £500, she actually said it wouldn't be enough to cover the cost of the damages, while he thought he had been giving her a generous amount. And throughout the embassy, Peter learned a lot of useful skills such as sailing, shipbuilding, and carpentry. He took a lot of inspiration from England's navy to build Russia's navy. Peter also made efforts to introduce Western fashion to the Russian court, including charging nobles a tax for growing out their beards. He even carried some scissors around on his person in case he saw somebody walking around that hadn't paid their beard tax. He also spoke out against the practice of arranged marriages. He said that the practice was outdated and would often lead to cases of domestic abuse. It was also following his travels that the Moscow School of Mathematics and Navigation was founded. He also made education mandatory for all noble children aged 10 to 15. He also issued construction of the Peterhof Palace, which has been referred to as the Russian Versailles. When Peter had been abroad, he was informed of a revolt back in Moscow. He responded by returning to Russia and crushing the rebellion. He also disbanded the organization of the Streltsy and had hundreds of the Streltsy executed, even going so far as displaying their bodies on the streets of Moscow. And it was through this effort that he had finally taken revenge on the corps that had caused him so much anguish in his childhood. Peter's reign was also marked by the Great Northern War. This was a war that Russia fought against the Swedish Empire along with Denmark, Norway, and Saxony. And this would eventually lead to Russia gaining access to the Baltic Sea, which also allowed Peter to found the city of St. Petersburg, very humbly named after himself. The war was officially ended by the Russo-Swedish Treaty of Nystad. This ended up leaving Russia as the dominant power of the Baltic region. And it was here that Peter adopted the title of Emperor. Russia had officially become an empire. This is also when people started to refer to him as the Great. They also engaged in war with the Ottomans. He also launched a war against Persia, but that war actually ended with Russia and Persia creating an alliance against the Ottomans. When it came to Peter's personal life, he was married in his youth to Eudoxia Lopukina. She had been chosen by Peter's mother. And while it's said that Eudoxia did love Peter, that love was blatantly unrequited. He frequently had mistresses, and although the couple had 3 children together, only one survived to adulthood. And while Peter had been away in Europe, he actually asked his family members to convince his wife to become a nun. Eventually, she was banished to a convent. In the early 1700s, Peter also met one of his favorite mistresses, Marta Helena Skoronska. She eventually converted to Russian Orthodoxy and took the name Ekaterina, or Catherine. And the couple were officially married in 1712, but believe it or not, this actually wasn't the biggest scandal of Peter's reign. Peter the Great's son Alexei didn't take much interest in affairs of state, so much so that Peter threatened to cut him off if he didn't start stepping up. Alexei also asked for his own infant son, also named Peter, to be made the heir instead, but Peter said that Alexei would have to become a monk in order to remove any possible threat. And then Alexei went abroad, but when he failed to return in a timely manner, Peter told him that he needed to return or else he would lose all claim. Alexei then defected to Vienna and then hid in Naples. He said that he would only return to Russia if his father would grant his wish to marry his mistress. But when Alexei returned to Moscow, his wishes were not granted. Fearing a coup, Peter had Alexei and his supporters detained. Alexei confessed and gave up the names of most of his friends who may have wished to plan a coup. As a result, his own mother, Peter's first wife, was tried for adultery. Alexei's friends were also tortured or executed, and most of his servants were either mutilated or killed. And though the torture didn't lead to any direct evidence, Alexei himself was tried and tortured. Peter himself even participated in the torture. The Tsar's son eventually died in prison. As Peter grew older, he suffered from a serious bladder infection, which worsened until he died in 1725, aged just 52. At his deathbed was his second wife, Catherine, and their daughters by his side. And what's important to note here is that Peter didn't name a successor, so a resulting coup had to decide the heir for themselves. Tune in to the next episode when we talk about Catherine I, who rose from being a servant to Peter the Great's mistress to Empress of Russia.